Before kingship descended from heaven, before cities rose from the dust, the laws of existence were etched in stone by the Anunnaki. They were meant to last for eternity. But stone can be broken, and laws can be forgotten. This is the story of the law that was lost, and of the man tasked with recarving destiny itself, a man whose chisel strokes could either restore the divine order or shatter it forever. This is the story of Azag, the stone shaper of Eridu. Before our story begins, if you enjoy tales from the ancient world, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows these stories to be told. Now, let us journey to Eridu. The city of Eridu, the first city, was not so much built upon the land as it was coaxed from it. It was a place born of the marriage between water and clay, a testament to the will of Enki, the god of wisdom, whose spirit moved in the shimmering canals that were the city's veins. In the pre-dawn light, a visitor standing on the western causeway would not see a clear demarcation between civilization and the wild, but a gentle blending. The scent of the great Euphrates marshes, of damp earth, crushed reeds, and the subtle brine of ancient waters permeated the very air within the city walls, a constant reminder of the primordial chaos from which this order had been painstakingly raised. The heat, even at this early hour, was not merely a condition of the climate. It was a sacred presence, an oppressive and ever-present weight that seemed to press down from the heavens, baking the mud-brick homes into a uniform, dusty ochre. Above this sensory tapestry, there was a sound, or rather the absence of it. It was a hum, a low, resonant frequency that emanated from the city's heart, the towering ziggurat dedicated to Enki. This was the hum of devotion, of 1,000 lives lived in accordance with a divine plan, a collective prayer so constant it had become as natural as the flow of the river itself. Eridu was a reflection of the cosmic order, a place where every canal, every brick, every life was aligned to a purpose greater than itself. At the very core of this alignment, in the heart of the ziggurat known as the Abzu, the house of the cosmic ocean, lay the stela of cosmic law. It was not a monument in the mortal sense, not a thing erected to commemorate a victory or a king. It was the physical embodiment of the me, the universal decrees handed down by the Anunnaki at the dawn of time. Fashioned from a single, flawless block of black diorite, its surface was polished to a liquid sheen, reflecting the dim torchlight of the inner sanctum with the depth of a starless night sky. Millennia of veneration by priests who dared not touch it had imbued it with an almost living presence. Its face was covered in cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped marks carved with such impossible precision and depth that they seemed not to have been cut by any tool, but to have emerged from within the stone itself, a natural feature of its creation. It stood in the most sacred chamber, a place of absolute silence where the air was still and cool, untouched by the heat outside. The stela was the anchor that moored not only Eridu, but all of known civilization, to the unwavering order of the cosmos. It was the promise of the gods made manifest, the ultimate reality set in stone. Far from the hallowed silence of the ziggurat, on the city's periphery where the ordered streets began to fray into dusty tracks, was the workshop of Azag. It was a place of shadow and grit, the air thick with the fine, silicate dust of 100 different stones. Here, the world was not defined by divine decrees but by the tangible realities of geology and force. Azag's hands were a testament to his trade. The palms were a landscape of calluses and faded white scars, the knuckles thick and hardened from a lifetime of labor. Yet these same hands could coax a line finer than a human hair from a block of stubborn basalt, could feel the hidden flaws within a piece of alabaster with a simple touch. He was a master of his craft, a shaper of stone whose skill was both a blessing and a mark of his otherness. For Azag was of a mixed heritage, a fact that defined his place in the rigid hierarchy of Eridu. His mother had been a mortal woman of the city, but his father was an Apkallu, one of the lesser divine beings, the 7 sages who served Enki himself. This semi-divine blood granted him his preternatural talent with stone, but it also made him an outcast. He was respected for his skill, sought after by priests and nobles for his work, but he was never truly accepted. He was a creature of the threshold, belonging neither to the world of men nor to the realm of the divine. His only true communion was with the silent, patient language of the stone he shaped. The tremor came without warning. It was not the violent, chaotic shaking of the earth in anger. It was something deeper, more fundamental. It was a lurch, a sickening heave in the very fabric of reality, as if the world had slipped a cog in the great cosmic machine. For a single, terrifying moment, everything stopped. The ever-present hum of the city ceased. The wind died. The birds in the marshlands fell silent. Then came the sound. It was not a thunderous crash, not a roar of destruction. It was a single, resonant crack. It was a sound that did not echo in the ears but in the soul, a sharp, crystalline note of finality that every man, woman, and child in Eridu felt in the marrow of their bones. It was the sound of a promise breaking, the sound of an anchor snapping its chain. It was the sound of order undone. A wave of muted panic washed through the city. It was a fear too profound for screaming. People spilled from their homes into the dusty streets, their faces turned upward, not toward the sky, but toward the silent, monolithic form of the ziggurat. They were seeking an answer, a reassurance that the center still held. Inside the temple, the serene calm was shattered. Acolytes in white linen robes ran through the corridors, their sandals slapping against the cool stone floors. Their movements were frantic, undirected. One of them, a young priest named Sharam, his face a mask of pale dread, was the first to reach the innermost chamber. He pushed open the great cedar doors and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The hallowed space, a place of immutable stillness for ages uncounted, was in disarray. And in the center of the chamber, where the anchor of the world should have stood, there was only a scattered ruin. The stela of cosmic law, the unchangeable, eternal word of the gods, lay in 100 pieces on the polished marble floor. The high priest, Idamsin, arrived moments later. He was a man whose age was impossible to guess. His face a network of fine lines that seemed less a product of time and more a map of ancient wisdom. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his presence radiating an authority that silenced the panicked whispers of the younger priests. He surveyed the scene of cosmic vandalism, and his expression did not change. There was no shock, no anger, no despair. His serene, mask-like calm was more terrifying than any outburst of rage could have been. He glided past the trembling Sharam and knelt, not in prayer, but as a master strategist assesses a lost battle. With a hand that was steady and sure, he reached out and touched a single, large fragment of the diorite. He did not inspect the break or the script. He simply held his fingers to the cold, dead stone, his gaze distant, his head cocked slightly as if listening for a divine voice that had, for the first time in history, gone silent. The weight of the moment settled upon the chamber, thick and suffocating. This was not merely a broken monument. This was a message. The gods had either abandoned them, or they were testing them in a way so profound it was beyond mortal comprehension. The summons came in the suffocating heat of the afternoon. 2 temple guards, their bronze helmets glinting in the sun, appeared at the threshold of Azag's workshop. Their faces were grim, their eyes holding the flat, incurious look of men carrying out an order they did not understand. Azag's first reaction was a jolt of pure fear. He dropped the small polishing stone he was holding, his mind racing through a list of potential blasphemies. Had a client been displeased? Had he used a sacred design on a profane object? In Eridu, the line between reverence and sacrilege was as fine as the edge of a chisel. The guards did not speak. One of them simply gestured with his spear, a curt, commanding motion for Azag to follow. The journey through the city was a silent procession of shame. The citizens, still dazed and fearful from the morning's event, parted before the guards, their eyes following Azag. In their gazes, he saw a mixture of pity and suspicion. He was the outsider, the half-blood, and in times of crisis, the first to be blamed. He was brought not into the temple, but to its base, standing in the immense shadow of the ziggurat. There, beside a ceremonial gate, Idamsin waited. The high priest looked at Azag, his eyes ancient and piercing, and for a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind stirring the dust. When Idamsin finally spoke, his voice was low, yet it carried the immense weight of his office, cutting through the ambient noise of the city. He did not waste time with pleasantries or accusations. He explained the catastrophe with the cold, precise language of a scribe recording a historical fact. He did not ask Azag if he could repair the stela. He commanded him to remake it. "The Anunnaki gave us order," Idamsin said, his gaze fixed on Azag's scarred hands. "That order is now dust on the temple floor. You, son of the Apkallu, you who knows the secret language of stone, will make it whole again." He took a step closer, his presence almost overwhelming. "You will not copy the laws. You will restore them. You will take the memory of the stone, the voice of the gods trapped in these fragments, and you will carve it anew. You will make the new stone forget it was ever broken." Azag was led into the sacred chamber, a place no one of his station had ever been permitted to enter. The air was thick with the smells of old incense, myrrh, and the sharp, dry scent of shattered stone. His eyes, accustomed to the bright glare of his workshop, struggled to adjust to the dim, holy light. And then he saw it. The sight that greeted him sent a wave of sickness through his craftsman's soul. It was a desecration, a work of such perfection, of such impossible balance and form, reduced to rubble. He knelt, his professional horror overriding his fear of the divine. He ran his fingers along the edge of a clean break, his touch light, analytical. But as he examined the fragments, a flicker of awe ignited beneath his revulsion. This was not the chaotic damage of an earthquake. The fractures were too clean, the lines of breakage too precise. It was as if the stone had not been broken by an external force, but had shattered from within, torn apart by the sheer, unbearable weight of the divine words it had been forced to contain for so long. He was given a secluded courtyard within the temple precinct to serve as his new workshop. It was a place of isolation, walled off from the rest of the temple, a sacred quarantine. His own tools were deemed profane for this task. Instead, he was provided with a new set, each one consecrated in a lengthy ritual. There were chisels of the finest bronze, their edges honed to a razor sharpness, and hammers carved from polished meteorite, dense and cool to the touch. His task was twofold and monumental. First, he was to collect every single fragment, every shard, every grain of dust from the temple floor. He was to piece them together like a puzzle of cosmic importance, reassembling the divine text so that it could be read in its entirety. Only then could he begin the second, even more daunting task, carving a new, perfect replica, a stela so flawless it would be as if the original had never been broken. The weight of civilization, of the very agreement between gods and men, had been placed upon his shoulders. He was no longer a simple craftsman. He was to become the vessel, the living conduit, for divine law. The work began. The world outside his courtyard ceased to exist. Days blurred into a sun-scorched haze, and nights became a cool, lamp-lit silence. Azag worked with a single-minded devotion, a trance-like focus that was part meditation, part grueling labor. He built a vast, flat tablet of wet clay, and upon this surface, he meticulously cleaned and arranged the hundreds of diorite fragments. It was a slow, painstaking process. He pieced together the laws of the harvest, dictating the cycles of planting and reaping. He reassembled the edicts of justice, the precise punishments for theft and violence. He joined the fragments describing the complex rituals of worship, the proper sacrifices for each of the great gods. The narrator's voice could have recited some of them in a slow, liturgical tone, giving a sense of their all-encompassing nature. Let the shepherd render his count of lambs, 1 in 10 for the temple storehouse. Let the debtor who cannot pay his silver give his son in service, for a term of 3 years. Let no man alter the boundary stone of his neighbor, for its place is decreed by heaven. For the hierarchy is fixed. As the gods are to mankind, so is the king to his subjects, the father to his son, the master to his servant. This is the order. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The great puzzle was nearly complete. Only a handful of the smallest, most difficult-to-place fragments remained, scattered on the clay tablet like a constellation of black stars. One night, Azag worked late, his eyes burning with fatigue, the flame of his single oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. He was fitting the final pieces from the base of the stela, a section that had always been shrouded in shadow in the temple, a place no mortal was ever meant to read clearly. His fingers, calloused but sensitive, closed around the last shard. It was a small, triangular piece no larger than his thumb. He brushed the dust from its surface and held it close to the lamp, tilting it to catch the light. The script on this fragment was different. It was subtle, but to his expert eye, it was undeniable. The style of the cuneiform was more archaic, the wedges cut with a slightly different angle. It was older. His heart began to beat faster. Slowly, painstakingly, he deciphered the signs, his lips moving silently as he translated the ancient words. The narrator's voice would drop to a near whisper, a tone of hushed discovery, translating alongside Azag. Ud, dan, ki, sud, sud, nam. When the heavens hold their breath, nam, tar, alright, by nu, till, la, am, and the destinies are unwritten, isu, lu, adinger, ri, kini, the hand of man, gis, nabie, ag, shall weigh the balance. Azag stared at the shard, a chill creeping up his spine despite the warm night air. This was not a law. It was not a command or a prohibition. It was a loophole, prophecy, a sliver of free will of human agency, inserted at the very foundation of a deterministic universe. It was a profound heresy, hidden in plain sight for millennia. The chilling realization dawned on him. The divine order he had been commanded to restore was built upon a secret, and that secret was now in his hands. The stillness of the temple courtyard was absolute, yet a storm raged within Azag. He sat before the small, heretical fragment, the oil lamp casting a flickering glow on its impossible words. He was a man of order, a man whose entire life had been governed by the precise lines he cut into stone, by the predictable rules of his craft. His training, his ingrained reverence, his fear of the gods, every part of his being screamed at him to dismiss what he had found. It had to be an error, a mistake made by a scribe in an age of primordial chaos, a madness carved into the foundation and forgotten. To ignore it was the path of safety, of duty. He could simply piece the stela together, omit this one confounding line, and no one would ever know. His task was to restore, not to interpret. And yet, the Apkallu blood in his veins, the faint, divine spark he had inherited from his father, resonated with the shard. It recognized the power in those words, the deep, fundamental truth they contained. To restore the stela without this line would be to carve a perfect, beautiful lie. To include it would be to start a revolution that could unmake the world. With trembling hands, Azag made a decision. He took the fragment, wrapped it carefully in a spare piece of clean linen, and walked to the far corner of his workshop. There, a section of the mud brick wall was loose. He prized a brick from its place, tucked the wrapped shard into the hollow space behind it, and sealed it back up. The secret was hidden, buried within the very walls of the temple precinct. He returned to his work, to the great clay tablet where the other laws lay in their proper order. But the rhythm was broken. His hands, once so sure, now felt clumsy. The perfect, unwavering lines of the law no longer seemed like a source of comfort and stability. They seemed like the bars of a cage. He picked up a fragment inscribed with the laws of property, of debts and contracts, but as he set it in its place, all he could think about was the unwritten law of choice, the prophecy that man could weigh the balance. The secret festered within him, a seed of doubt poisoning his concentration. Haunted, he knew he could not continue his work until he understood. He needed answers. Under the pretext of clarifying an obscure term related to stonework found in ancient contracts, he requested access to the Edubba, the temple's revered tablet house. The senior scribe, a wizened man with suspicious eyes, granted him permission, but with a strict time limit. The archive was a labyrinth of clay. The air smelled of dust and ages, a dry, academic scent that clung to the back of the throat. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets were stacked from floor to ceiling in dark wooden niches, each one a piece of his civilization's soul. Here were hymns praising the unshakable order of the great god Enlil, meticulous financial records from the temple bakeries, astronomical observations tracking the unvarying paths of the stars. It was a library of certainty, the oppressive weight of recorded history pressing in on him from all sides. His search was a desperate, frustrating exercise. He combed through tablets of law, of myth, of king lists. Everything he found confirmed the orthodox view. The gods decreed, and humanity obeyed. The cosmic order was fixed, perfect, and eternal. There was no mention, not even a whisper, of a balance to be weighed or of destinies left unwritten. He began to doubt his own sanity. Perhaps the fatigue had made him misread the signs. Perhaps the fragment was nothing more than a madman's carving, a piece of ancient graffiti that meant nothing. He could feel the eyes of the other priests and scribes on him as he worked. Their whispers followed him down the silent corridors. The stone shaper was taking too long. What was he really looking for? In the shadowed corners of the temple, there moved a figure of immense age and mystery. Inanna, the silent oracle. Decades ago, as a young priestess, she had been granted a vision so terrifying, so cosmically vast, that it had struck her dumb. She had taken a vow of absolute silence and had not uttered a word since. She communicated, when she chose to, by tracing ephemeral signs in a shallow wooden tray filled with fine sand. She was a keeper of the temple's deepest, most forgotten secrets, a living library whose catalog was known only to herself. From the cloisters and garden walkways, she had been observing Azag. Her eyes, dark and cloudy with age, held a knowledge that was both ancient and weary. She saw his furtive searching, the desperate energy that radiated from him, and she recognized the scent of a man who had stumbled upon a door that was meant to remain closed. Azag grew more desperate with each passing day. The blank diorite stela in his workshop seemed to mock him with its silent expectation. He knew he could not proceed with a lie in his heart, nor could he carve a truth he did not understand. He decided he had to risk everything. One evening, he saw Inanna tending to the sacred braziers in the main courtyard, her stooped figure a silhouette against the orange flames. He approached her slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The other priests kept a wide, respectful berth around the old oracle. Azag stopped a few feet from her. He did not speak. He could not. Instead, with a trembling hand, he knelt and used his finger to draw the cuneiform signs from the hidden fragment in the dust at his feet. The hand of man shall weigh the balance. He looked up at her, his face a plea for understanding. Inanna's reaction was almost imperceptible, but to Azag, it was a thunderclap. Her serene, impassive mask cracked. For the briefest of moments, her ancient eyes showed not wisdom, but a flicker of a deep and terrible fear. Her gaze darted around the courtyard, ensuring no one else had seen. Then, with a swift, almost angry motion, she smoothed the dust with her worn leather sandal, erasing the heretical words forever. She looked at Azag, shook her head once, a sharp, final gesture of dismissal, and turned her back on him, resuming her slow, methodical tending of the flames. Azag's heart sank. He had failed. He had revealed his dangerous secret to the one person who might have understood, and she had rejected him. He had risked everything for nothing. Dejected and defeated, Azag returned to his workshop. He resolved to put the matter from his mind. He was a craftsman, a tool in the hands of the priests, in the hands of the gods. It was not his place to question or to understand, only to do. He would forget the fragment. He would forget the oracle. He would be what they wanted him to be, a pair of skilled hands and nothing more. He picked up his finest chisel, the one reserved for carving the names of the gods, its bronze surface gleaming in the lamplight. He stood before the pristine, untouched block of new diorite. He would begin. He would carve the first law, the one proclaiming the supremacy of Anu in the heavens, and with that first cut, he would sever himself from the burden of his discovery. The narrator could describe the immense, suffocating pressure of that moment, the finality of making the first mark, the irrevocable act of beginning the great lie. He raised his meteorite hammer, his arm tensing for the blow. Just as he was about to strike, a shadow fell over the stone. He flinched and turned. It was Inanna. She stood silently in the doorway, her face unreadable in the flickering light. She had followed him. She looked from the blank, waiting surface of the stela, to the chisel in his hand, and then to his face. Her gaze was not one of warning or accusation. It was a look of appraisal, as if she were judging not his skill with a chisel, but the quality of his spirit, the strength of his soul. Without a word, she glided forward, her movements as silent as a moth's. She reached out with a hand as dry and wrinkled as old parchment and pressed something small, cylindrical, and cool into his waiting palm. It was a message tube, a small cylinder of baked clay, its ends sealed with bitumen, a relic from an age long past. Her eyes, no longer fearful but filled with a profound gravity, bored into his. She was conveying a message of immense importance and immense danger. She leaned in close, so close he could smell the scent of old herbs and parchment that clung to her robes. For the first time in 50 years, the silent oracle spoke. Her voice was not what he expected. It was a dry, rasping whisper, like sand skittering across a tombstone. It was a voice broken by disuse but still charged with an ancient power. She uttered only 2 words, her breath ghosting against his ear. The balance. Then, as silently as she had arrived, she turned and melted back into the shadows of the temple, leaving Azag alone in his workshop. He was left with the cryptic message, the cold, heavy weight of the sealed cylinder in his hand, and the chilling certainty that this object contained the truth he had been seeking. A truth that might very well cost him his life. Azag retreated to the absolute secrecy of his workshop, the 2 whispered words of the oracle echoing in the silence. He placed the small clay cylinder on his workbench, his hands hovering over it for a long moment. It was an object that radiated age, its surface smooth from the passage of countless, forgotten years. To break its seal felt like a desecration, a violation of a trust that had been kept since the foundations of the world were laid. It was an act of archaeology on a secret that was meant to remain buried. With a deep breath, he took a small bronze stylus and carefully chipped away at the brittle bitumen seals. They broke with a dry crack, releasing a puff of ancient air. He worked the cap loose and tipped the cylinder. Out slid a tightly rolled, impossibly thin sheet of beaten copper. Its surface turned a dark, verdant green by oxidation. He unrolled it with the utmost care. The sheet was covered in a script that made his heart stop. It was cuneiform, but of a form even more ancient than the archaic signs on the hidden fragment, a pictographic style from the very dawn of writing. Deciphering the text was an ordeal that consumed the next 2 days. It was not law. It was not a historical record. It was a poem, a sacred hymn titled, The 2 Creators. It told a version of the creation of mankind that Azag had never heard, a story that was not spoken of in the public rites or taught in the temple schools. It spoke not of the single, unified will of the Anunnaki, but of a profound and fundamental disagreement, a philosophical schism between the 2 sons of the great god Anu. It was the story of a debate between Enlil, lord of air and command, whose seat was in the austere city of Nippur, and Enki, lord of the Abzu and wisdom, the patron of Eridu itself. The hymn described their celestial argument in stark, powerful verses. Enlil, it sang, desired a simple, functional creation. He envisioned mankind as the Lulu Amalu, the primitive worker, a being designed for a single purpose, to serve the gods, to dig the canals, to build the temples, to harvest the grain, and to free the divine from all toil. His vision was for a creature of strong backs and empty minds, their lives governed by the perfect, unquestioning rhythm of absolute obedience. This, to Enlil, was the definition of order, a flawless, predictable machine of flesh and bone. The narrator's voice could adopt Enlil's persona. Stern, logical, and absolute, speaking of humanity as a resource to be managed, a problem of labor to be solved. But Enki, the hymn sang with a more lyrical, flowing cadence, had argued for more. He saw mankind not as tools, but as a potential echo of the divine. He argued that to create a being without the capacity for wonder was to create a hollow thing, an insult to the complexity of the cosmos. And so, in secret, he had altered the design. While the clay of mankind was being mixed, he had allowed a single drop of the Abzu's creative chaos to fall into the vessel, his own essence. With that drop, he gave them the capacity for questions, for art, for love, for grief. He gave them the Ngi Sugal, a term Azag had never before encountered, which the hymn translated as the wisdom in the hand. The spark that allowed a craftsman not just to follow a design, but to create beauty, that allowed a musician not just to play a note, but to compose a song. He gave them the potential to one day understand the balance. This was Enki's vision of a truer, more dynamic order, one that grew and evolved rather than simply existing. The hymn then revealed the great compromise that had ended the divine debate. Mankind was created as Enlil had wished, bound to toil, but with the secret spark of Enki hidden within their clay. The laws were written to enforce Enlil's vision of rigid order. But Enki had insisted on a final, secret addendum, a clause buried at the very foundation of the stela. The fragment Azag had found was that clause. It was Enki's failsafe, a prophetic promise that humanity's potential for choice was not a flaw, but a feature woven into the very fabric of reality. It was a seed, planted in stone, destined to be discovered only when the rigid, unyielding order of Enlil finally and inevitably failed, when the stela itself shattered under the weight of its own inflexibility. This revelation did not just change Azag's understanding. It shattered his entire worldview. The Anunnaki were not a monolith, a single, unified chorus of divine command. They were a pantheon of rivals, of individuals with competing philosophies, locked in a celestial debate that had shaped the very nature of his being. The breaking of the stela was not an accident of the earth. It was a cosmic event, an inevitability foretold at the beginning of time, triggered by the inherent, unresolved tension in creation itself. Perhaps, he thought with a tremor of awe, it had not been an accident at all. Perhaps it was an intervention, a signal from the silent God of the deep that the time for unquestioning obedience was over. He returned to the new stela, which now sat waiting in his workshop, and saw it with entirely new eyes. He no longer saw a simple list of laws. He saw a battlefield of ideas captured in stone, a transcript of the great divine argument. He looked at the section he had planned to carve next, the laws of agriculture. Before, they were simple commands. Now, he understood their dual meaning. The command to toil, to break the earth and bear the yoke of labor, was the voice of Enlil. But the knowledge of how to read the seasons, how to design the canals, how to make the earth yield its bounty, that was the gift of Enki. The law was not one thing, but a tense, delicate balance of two opposing forces. One night, utterly exhausted from his work and the weight of his new knowledge, he fell asleep on a pile of jute sacks in the corner of his workshop. He dreamed. He was sinking, falling slowly through a dark, silent ocean. It was the Abzu, the cosmic sea from which all life was born. But there was no fear, no panic of drowning. The water was not wet or cold. It was a medium of pure consciousness, and he felt a vast, ancient, and benevolent intelligence surrounding him. He knew, without being told, that he was in the presence of Enki's mind. He was shown visions not of the past, but of possibilities. He saw civilizations rise on the banks of great rivers, their towers gleaming in the sun, only to crumble into dust. He saw choices made by kings and by common men, each decision a stone dropped into the water, its ripples spreading out to shape destinies yet to come. He awoke with a sudden, sharp gasp. The workshop was cold, the pre-dawn air still and silent, but something had changed. His eyes were drawn to a simple clay jug of water he kept on his workbench for wetting his polishing stones. The water within it was shimmering, emitting a faint, unnatural, silvery luminescence. The light pulsed with a slow, gentle rhythm, like a sleeping heart. The The air was perfectly still, yet he felt a presence in the room with him, a deep and profound calm that was the waking echo of his dream. A voice spoke. It did not come from the doorway or from the shadows. It did not vibrate in the air or strike his eardrums. It formed, fully and clearly, directly inside his mind. It was a voice as calm and clear as undisturbed water. "The word is a seed," the voice said without preamble. "On what soil you plant, it determines the harvest. The law you carve is but one interpretation. There are others." The voice was neither male nor female, old nor young. It was the voice of wisdom itself. Azag sat frozen, trembling, a tide of awe and terror washing over him. He formed a question in his mind, too afraid to speak it aloud. "Who are you?" The light in the water jug pulsed a little brighter. "I am but a memory in the water," the voice replied, its tone patient, like a teacher to a favored student. "A messenger of the master of this house. You have understood the foundation, but a foundation alone is not a temple. To understand the law of one city is to be a prisoner of its walls. The balance you seek is not found in Eridu alone. You have seen the way of wisdom. Now you must see how the word is spoken in the city of command, and how it is sung in the city of passion. Your chisel is not yet wise enough to carve the truth." The presence, the light in the water, the voice in his head, they all faded at once, leaving Azag in the cold, silent workshop. He was alone, with the dust, the stone, and a new, terrifying mandate. His work in Eridu was not yet done. He first had to leave. He had to embark on a pilgrimage. The silence that descended upon the workshop in the hour before dawn was different now. It was no longer the comfortable quiet of a familiar space, but the vast, empty silence of a world that had suddenly grown immeasurably larger and more dangerous. Azag stood at the threshold, the command of the water spirit echoing in the chambers of his mind. He was a man of stone and enclosed spaces, his universe defined by the four walls of his workshop and the predictable grain of the materials he shaped. The world outside Eridu was an abstraction to him, a place of chaos and wandering ghosts, a subject of cautionary hymns recited by priests. The decision to leave was not born of courage, but of a terrifying, sacred obligation he felt pressed upon him. He felt less like a willing pilgrim and more like a stone dislodged by a flood, cast into a rushing river, unsure of where the current would carry him, or if he would be dashed to pieces against the rocks. His preparations for the journey were stark and simple, reflecting the mind of a man preparing for an ordeal, not an adventure. He filled a water skin of hardened leather, its surface dark and smooth from years of use. He packed a small pouch with a handful of dried dates and hard barley cakes, enough to sustain a body, but not to comfort it. Into a separate pouch, he placed his sharpest bronze tracing stylus and a small, perfectly flat, blank clay tablet. He could not break the habit of a lifetime. He needed a way to record, to make sense of things by giving them form. The narrator might linger on the humble, terrestrial nature of these items, contrasting them with the cosmic scale of the mission they were about to undertake. Most importantly, he carefully wrapped the heretical diorite fragment and the thin copper scroll in several layers of clean linen. He tucked this precious and dangerous bundle into a hidden pouch sewn on the inside of his tunic, where it rested against his heart, a constant, heavy reminder of his purpose. His departure from Eridu was a quiet betrayal of the city's rhythms. He left long before the first call to prayer echoed from the ziggurat, moving like a shadow through the sleeping streets he knew so well. The Great Western Gate, normally a chaotic hub of farmers, merchants, and pack animals, was a silent, monolithic maw in the pre-dawn gloom. The two guards on duty, drowsing in the heat, barely stirred as he slipped past them. The feeling of passing through that gate was like stepping off the edge of the known world. The ordered, familiar scent of the city's canals and hearth fires gave way instantly to the wild, primeval smell of the vast marshes beyond. A smell of decay and fecundity, of a world that existed without laws or gods. The first days of his journey north were a trial of the soul, a methodical stripping away of everything he knew. The landscape was a flat, merciless expanse under a white-hot sky, the horizon a shimmering, unbroken line that offered no landmarks and no comfort. The narrator's voice could become a slow, rhythmic meditation on the elements that governed this new reality. The searing sun that bleached all color from the world, the scouring wind that carried sand that stung the eyes and grit that coated the tongue, the endless, baked earth that seemed to drink the sweat from his body before it could form. Azag's internal world, once filled with complex thoughts of form and balance, shrank to the brutal simplicities of existence. The rhythm of his own footsteps, the burning in his lungs, and the dwindling, precious weight of the water in his skin. The voice of the spirit was gone. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone with his doubt. By the third day, a new sensation began to prickle at the edges of his awareness. The feeling of being watched. It was not the vast, indifferent gaze of a god from the heavens, but something far more terrestrial and predatory. A quiet, unnerving tension began to build. The desert heat played tricks on the eyes, turning distant, shimmering bushes into crouching figures. He would stop, his hand on the small knife at his belt, and stare until the illusion dissolved back into heat haze. At night, he built a small, meager fire of dried scrub, and he would hear the faint scuttling of unseen things just beyond the ring of its weak light. Sometimes, as he stared out into the immense, crushing darkness, he thought he saw the glint of eyes watching him back, but they were always gone when he looked directly at them. The attack, when it came, was as sudden and brutal as the landscape itself. They were desert nomads, for of them, their faces masked by dust-caked cloth that left only their hard, sun-crinkled eyes visible. They did not emerge with a war cry or a challenge. They rose from the earth itself, their grim, practiced silence more terrifying than any shout. Azag was no warrior. His life was one of patient, deliberate force, not of chaotic violence. His attempt to draw his knife and defend himself was clumsy and futile. The narrative would focus on the raw sensory details of the assault. The blinding glare of the sun in his eyes as a rough hand grabbed his shoulder, the acrid smell of unwashed bodies, the sharp, metallic taste of fear in his mouth as he was thrown to the ground, his head striking a rock. The world exploded into a brief, bright flash of pain. His rescue was not a grand, heroic entrance, but a swift, deadly, and efficient intervention. As one of the bandits knelt to rifle through his pouch, a figure appeared on a low rise of ground, backlit by the unforgiving sun, a stark silhouette against the sky. It was a woman. There was a blur of motion, the sun flashing on a curved bronze sickle sword. A short, sharp, surprised cry from one of the bandits, cut short with a wet gurgle. The woman moved with a desperate, practiced efficiency, an economy of motion that spoke of a life of survival. She did not fight like a soldier. She fought like a cornered animal, with absolute, lethal intent. The brutal dance was over in moments, leaving two of the bandits still and silent in the dust, and the other two scrambling away, vanishing back into the shimmering heat haze from which they had come. In the ringing silence that followed, broken only by the buzzing of flies, the woman approached Azag. She was not a priestess or a noblewoman. Her skin was the color of baked earth, weathered by sun and wind. Her dark hair was bound back with a simple leather cord. A small, intricate pendant of lapis lazuli, carved into an 8-pointed star, rested in the hollow of her throat. She knelt beside him and, without a word, began to clean the gash on his forehead with a strip of cloth she dipped into her own precious water. Her touch was firm, impersonal, yet profoundly reassuring. Her name, she said after a moment, was Amida. Her voice was as dry as the desert air. As she worked, her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and missing nothing, assessed him. They took in his soft, uncalloused feet, his craftsman's hands, the fine quality of his tunic now stained with dust and blood. It is a long and foolish road to Nippur for a man who holds a chisel like it's his only child, she said, her tone flat, a statement of fact, not a question. She had seen his tools scattered on the ground. What does the city of locked gates have that Eridu does not? Azag, wary and still shaken, his head throbbing, gave her a partial truth. He pushed himself into a sitting position, testing his limbs. I am a master stone shaper, he said, trying to make his voice sound steady and professional. "I have been commissioned for a great work. I seek to study the ancient inscriptions on the monuments near the Eker Temple for inspiration." Amida finished tying the makeshift bandage around his head. She looked at him, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of something in her dark eyes. It might have been disbelief, or perhaps it was pity. "The only inspiration one finds in Nippur," she remarked dryly, "is the beauty of a perfectly built cage." She rose to her feet in a single, fluid motion. "The desert is no place to be alone. We walk together until the city walls. My path is also north." It was not an offer. It was a statement. That night, they made a shared camp under a sky of impossible clarity, the stars like scattered diamonds on black velvet. The fire crackle was a small point of human defiance against the immense, silent dark. Azag watched Amita as she turned away from the fire, her back to him. She faced the northern sky, toward the constellation of the Great Queen. She held up her small lapis lazuli pendant, the 8-pointed star, so that it caught the starlight. She began to whisper a prayer, a soft, intense murmur that he could not quite hear. It was not a prayer of supplication, not a plea for favor from a distant god. It had the cadence of a longing, a declaration of faith. The desert wind carried a few of the words to him across the fire. For the loosening of chains, for the courage of the heart, for the sacred chaos. He froze, a cold dread washing over him that had nothing to do with the desert night. He realized his rescuer was not simply a fellow traveler. She was a believer in a different kind of order entirely, one that did not revere the rigid laws of the great gods, but the untamable passions of mortals. And he was walking with her, straight into Nippur, the heart of their sworn enemy. Their arrival at the gates of Nippur was an exercise in pure intimidation. Eridu had grown organically around its temple, its walls a protective embrace. Nippur, the seat of Enlil, Lord of Command, felt engineered for control. Massive, sun-bleached walls of mud brick, twice the height of Eridu's, rose sheer from the flat plain, their surfaces unbroken by any decoration save for the arrow slits that stared down like vacant eyes. The main gate was not an entrance but a choke point, a long, shadowed tunnel flanked by colossal stone statues of glowering Lamassu, winged bulls with the stern, bearded faces of ancient kings. The narrator could describe the feeling of passing through that gate as one of being swallowed, of willingly stepping out of the open, unpredictable world and into a place of rigid, unyielding definition. The very air inside seemed heavier, more disciplined, the chaotic sounds of the open plain replaced by a muted, purposeful hum. From their first steps inside, the city's heart was visible, dominating the skyline not with grace, but with brute presence. It was the Eker, the mountain house, the great ziggurat of Enlil. Azag looked at it with the critical eye of a stone shaper and felt a professional chill. Where Enki's Abzu and Eridu seemed to spiral towards the heavens, its lines flowing and almost liquid, the Eker was a stark, angular monument to absolute authority. It was a series of massive, stacked cubes, each line perfectly straight, each corner a precise right angle. It did not seem to invite the worshipper toward wisdom, as the Abzu did. The Eker felt like a fortress, a judge's bench from which the entire world was scrutinized and found wanting. It was a statement in brick and bitumen that the universe was not a mystery to be explored, but a set of rules to be obeyed. As he and Amida moved through the city's streets, the oppressive atmosphere was palpable. The boulevards were wide, straight, and unervingly clean. The people they passed did not stroll or linger. They moved with a somber, efficient purpose, their eyes cast downward. There was no loud haggling in the market, no children playing games in the alleyways. At every major intersection, a stone pillar stood, its surface carved with a law and the precise punishment for its infraction. Temple scribes, dressed in severe gray robes, sat at small tables in the public squares, their styluses clicking like insects as they recorded every transaction, every contract, every tithe paid. Nippur was a perfectly functioning machine, and its people were the silent, interchangeable cogs. Azag witnessed the brutal perfection of Enlil's law in the main square, beneath the unblinking gaze of the ziggurat. A farmer, a man whose face was a mask of terrified resignation, was being tied to a wooden post. A priest stood before him, holding a clay tablet. The farmer's crime, the priest recited in a cold, monotone voice that carried across the silent square, was that his grain tithe to the temple was short by a mere handful of measures. The priest made no mention of the blight that had struck the barley fields that season. The law was the law, circumstance was irrelevant. The narrator would describe the scene with a cold, detached clarity, focusing not on the gore, but on the chillingly precise ritual of it all. The sound of the leather whip whistling through the air, the dull thud as it struck flesh, and the silent, fearful, yet accepting faces of the crowd who watched. This was not justice as Azag understood it. It was accounting written in blood. That evening, as the shadows of the Eker stretched long and black across the city, Amita led Azag away from the main thoroughfares. She guided him through a maze of narrow, shadowed alleys that seemed to exist in defiance of the city's rigid grid. They arrived at a small, unassuming house, its door identical to 100 others. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of crushed herbs. A handful of people, a weaver, a potter, an old soldier with a scarred face, were gathered in a circle. In the center of the room, on a low table, was a simple, unmarked altar. It was adorned not with the severe symbols of the great gods, but with a scattering of wildflowers, clearly smuggled in from the world outside the walls, and small, beautifully carved wooden birds. This was a secret shrine to Inanna, the goddess of love, passion, and the beautiful, sacred chaos of life. Here, in this hidden pocket of defiance, Amita finally told Azag the truth. They were the Salibi, a name that meant the ones of the heart. They were a hidden faith, a quiet rebellion of the soul against the tyranny of perfect order. Amita, her voice no longer dry but filled with a quiet, passionate fire, articulated their philosophy as she lit a small stick of incense before the altar. Enlil gives you a world without pain, but it is also a world without joy, she said, her dark eyes meeting Azag's. He gives you purpose, but it is the purpose of an ox turning a millstone, a circle that leads nowhere. We believe the gods gave us hearts that beat, blood that runs hot, and minds that are meant to question. To deny these gifts, to lock them away in the name of safety and order, is the only true blasphemy. She explained their belief, that Enlil's rigid order was not for the benefit of mankind, but for the comfort of the gods. It was a cage, meticulously built to protect the divine from the frightening, unpredictable potential of the human heart. Azag was profoundly conflicted. He had seen the soul-crushing cruelty of Nippur's perfection. He had felt the lash on the farmer's back as if it were his own, but his craftsman's soul, his deep, ingrained need for structure and design, still recoiled from the idea of pure chaos. Without law, there is nothing, he argued, his voice low but firm. He gestured vaguely at the well-made walls around them. No cities, no craft, no safety from the desert and its raiders. There is only the howling of the wind and the fear of the dark. Their debate was quiet but intense. A clash of two fundamental worldviews played out in a hidden room in the heart of the enemy's city. It was the architect versus the artist, the line versus the curve, order versus freedom. Unseen by them, a neighbor in the adjoining house, a devout and fearful man who had lived his entire life by the letter of Enlil's law, pressed his ear to the thin mud-brick wall. He heard their raised, passionate voices. He could not make out every word, but he heard enough. He heard dangerous words like freedom, chains, heart, and defiance. In a city built on the bedrock of obedience, these were words of treason, sparks that could ignite a devastating fire. Believing he was fulfilling his highest civic and religious duty, the man slipped out of his house and made his way through the darkening streets toward the looming, silent ziggurat to find the temple guard. The summons, when it came, was not a request. It was an arrest. The door to the small house burst open, and two temple guards, their faces impassive and their bronze-scaled armor glinting in the lamplight, stepped inside. At a sharp gesture from Amita, Her followers instantly scattered, melting into the shadows of the house and out a back exit with the practiced speed of those long used to fleeing. Azag, a stranger and a man of slow, deliberate movements, was left standing alone as the guards advanced on him. He was taken alone to the Eker. He was not brought to a grand hall, but to a severe, unadorned chamber deep within the ziggurat's base. The walls were bare stone, the only furniture a simple stone table and 2 chairs. There he was brought face to face with the high priest of Enlil, a man named Enlil. The priest was a thin, ascetic man, his body withered by fasts, but his eyes were alive with a piercing, analytical intelligence. They were the eyes of a man who saw every flaw, every crack in the soul. The interrogation was a masterpiece of psychological pressure. Enlil did not shout or threaten. He spoke softly, his words precise and as sharp as freshly knapped obsidian. He gestured for Azag to sit. A messenger bird flies faster than a man walks, stone shaper. The priest began, his voice a dry rustle. He already knew. A message had been sent from Idumsin in Eridu, reporting the progress on the stela. So, the great law of Eridu is broken, and you have been chosen to restore it. A great honor. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Tell me, he continued, leaning forward slightly, his sharp eyes fixed on Azag. In your great work of restoration, when you come to the law that says mankind shall serve the gods, where do you place the emphasis in your heart? On the service or on the man? The question was a perfectly crafted trap. It was not about what he would carve, but what he believed. Azag's brief, flickering hesitation, the momentary conflict that flashed in his eyes, was all the answer Enlil needed. Enlil rose slowly from his chair, his thin lips pressed into a grim line. Your hands are skilled, son of the Apkallu, he declared, his soft voice now edged with the coldness of a final judgment. But your heart is soft clay, misshapen by the chaotic whispers of the Abzu. You are not a restorer. You are a flaw in the design, an agent of chaos. He raised one thin, bony hand, a signal to the 2 guards who stood waiting by the door. They stepped forward, iron shackles clinking in their hands. But just as they reached for Azag, a sudden commotion erupted from the temple's main courtyard outside the chamber. Shouts echoed down the stone corridors. A cry of fire, fire in the granary, went up. In the ensuing confusion, the chamber door flew open again. It was Amida. She had rallied her followers, creating a desperate, suicidal diversion. She stood silhouetted against the distant orange glow of flames, a burning torch in one hand and her bronze sickle sword in the other. Her face was grim, her eyes blazing with defiant purpose. The way of order is a cage, stone shaper, she shouted to Azag over the growing din of alarm bells and running feet. Now you will learn the way of chaos. She lunged into the room, pushed a guard aside, and pulled Azag out of the chamber and into the pandemonium of a holy temple in turmoil. The escape from the Eker was a chaotic blur of smoke, panicked shouting, and the desperate rhythm of running feet. Amida, a creature of this chaotic element, moved with a certainty that defied the confusion around them. She guided Azag, who was utterly disoriented, through a network of secret passages he never could have imagined existed within the fortress of order. Narrow service tunnels beneath the temple granaries, forgotten corridors behind sacred shrines, a steep staircase that seemed to lead down into the very foundations of the ziggurat. The narrator would describe Azag's internal state. He, a man of plans, of precise lines and calculated angles, was now completely adrift, a passenger in Amida's world of instinct and improvisation. He was learning that chaos, too, had its own form of wisdom. They emerged from a ventilation shaft into the night, far from the burning granary and the confusion of the temple guards. They fled Nippur, slipping through a small, unguarded tradesman's gate in the western wall. Their journey south towards Uruk was a complete reversal of Azag's first pilgrimage. Before, he had been a scholar seeking knowledge in a world of perceived order. Now, he was a fugitive seeking refuge in a world he was quickly learning was anything but ordered. Amida, in her element, became his teacher. She taught him the practical arts of survival that the civilized man had forgotten. How to read the patterns of the stars for direction, how to find the hidden water sources the nomads used, how to walk on rocky ground so as to leave no trace for their pursuers. He was learning a different kind of wisdom, one written not in stone tablets, but in the subtle language of the earth itself. As they traveled, their philosophical debate from the hidden shrine in Nippur continued, but its tone had changed. It was no longer a clash of opposing certainties. Azag had seen the soul-crushing failure of absolute order. Amida had seen the terrible cost of her rebellion, the risk to her followers, the violence she had been forced to commit. They no longer argued for their own viewpoint, but began to search for a third way, a path that might exist between the cage of rigid law and the destructive fire of anarchy. Even a wild river needs banks to guide it, Azag argued one night as they sat by their small fire. Or else it becomes a destructive flood, washing everything away. Amida, watching the flames dance, countered. And even the strongest banks must follow the natural flow of the water. If they try to force it against its nature, the river will simply rise and destroy them. Their arrival at the great city of Uruk, the seat of the goddess Inanna, was a sensory shock that made Nippur seem like a tomb. If Nippur was silence and order, Uruk was a chaotic symphony of noise, color, and unrestrained life. The gates of the city were wide open, and a river of humanity flowed in and out. The markets were a riot of sound and smell, filled with merchants from distant lands selling exotic spices, brightly colored textiles, and caged birds. The air was thick with the sounds of music from a dozen different instruments, the shouts of vendors, the laughter of children, and the passionate arguments of poets in the wine shops. The narrator would describe the city not as a machine, but as a sprawling, living organism. Unpredictable, messy, occasionally dangerous, but vibrantly, undeniably alive. The people of Uruk were as different from the citizens of Nippur as fire is from stone. They laughed loudly and from the belly. They argued in the streets with wild gestures. They adorned themselves in bright linen robes of saffron and crimson, and wore jewelry of carnelian and gold. Their laws, Azag quickly learned, were more like guidelines, a set of principles that were enforced with a flexibility and an understanding of human weakness that would be unthinkable in Enlil's city. Here, human ambition, desire, and passion were not seen as sins to be suppressed, but as powerful energies to be celebrated, channeled, and woven into the fabric of the city's life. Amida led him to the heart of the city, to the great Inanna temple complex, dedicated to Inanna. It was not a single, monolithic fortress like the Eker. Instead, it was an open, sprawling compound of gardens, workshops, shrines, and public courtyards. In one courtyard, Azag saw poets competing to compose the most beautiful hymn to the goddess. In another, dancers rehearsed for an upcoming ritual, their movements fluid and expressive. In a shaded portico, he saw the temple's famous courtesans, women who were not just objects of desire but also respected scholars and priestesses, debating philosophy with gray-bearded academics. The Inanna was a place where the sacred and the profane, the spiritual and the sensual, were not separated, but were seen as two sides of the same divine coin, dancing together in a celebration of life. Here in Uruk, Amida's faith was not a hidden cult, but a respected and influential philosophical school. She introduced Azag to her counterparts, the high priests and priestesses of Inanna. They welcomed him not as a fugitive, but as a seeker. They showed him their vast libraries, where the laws of the gods were kept alongside poems of love and epic tales of human heroism. They explained their interpretation of the law, that the divine decrees that Azag thought were immutable, were not a rigid code to be blindly obeyed. They were a set of divine principles that humanity was meant to wrestle with, to reinterpret, to argue with, and even to challenge in its long, messy journey towards a deeper wisdom. That night, Azag was invited to a great ritual in Inanna's honor. It took place in the central courtyard of the Inanna, under the stars. It was a wild, ecstatic ceremony of chanting, drumming, and dancing that grew in intensity as the night wore on. Hundreds of people moved as one, their individual identities seeming to dissolve into the collective energy of the crowd. The narrator would describe the scene from Azag's perspective, the overwhelming sensory input of the pounding drums, the swirling colors, the intoxicating scent of burning juniper and night-blooming flowers. For a man like Azag, so used to silence and solitude, it was both terrifying and exhilarating. He felt the rigid boundaries of his own self begin to soften and dissolve. In the deepest throes of the ritual near dawn, when his body was exhausted and his senses were heightened to a razor's edge, Azag experienced a vision. It was not a dream, but a waking trance, as if the world had peeled back to show him the machinery behind reality. He saw two divergent paths stretching before him into the mists of the future, two possible destinies for mankind. On one path, he saw the world of Enlil's law brought to its ultimate perfection. He saw gleaming, silent cities of impossible geometric precision. There was no hunger, no war, no crime. Humanity moved in perfect, synchronized patterns. But as the vision drew closer, he saw that their faces were blank, their eyes empty. There was no art on the walls, no music in the air, no laughter in the streets. There were no questions. Humanity had become a perfectly kept, perfectly safe, and perfectly empty herd, living and dying without ever having truly lived at all. On the other path, he saw the world of Inanna's chaos completely unleashed, without the guidance of any law. It was a world of breathtaking, untamed beauty and terrifying, constant violence. Civilizations rose like brilliant, brief fireworks, creating works of astonishing art and passion, only to collapse into ruin and be swallowed by the jungle. Humanity was completely free, but it was the brutal freedom of the beast in the forest, a constant, bloody struggle for survival, a life of intense, fleeting moments with no past and no future. He recoiled in horror from both visions. Both were perfect in their own way and both were monstrous. And then, for a fleeting, heart-stopping instant, in the space between the two paths, he saw a flicker of a third possibility. It was not a road, but a narrow, treacherous, winding trail, clinging to the edge of a cliff between the two extremes. It was a path of balance. He could not see where it led. The vision shattered, leaving him on his knees in the temple courtyard, the first cool light of dawn on his face. He finally understood. His task was not to choose the law of Enlil or the freedom of Inanna. His task was to return to Eridu and, with his own two hands, carve the first, uncertain step onto that new, unknown path. The journey back to Eridu was a quiet, contemplative passage. The frantic urgency of the fugitive had been replaced by the heavy, measured tread of a man burdened with purpose. Azag was no longer the same person who had fled the city weeks before. The narrator could describe the subtle but profound change in him. His eyes, the eyes of a craftsman trained to see the surface of things, the grain of wood, the color of stone, now saw the world differently. He looked at a river and saw not just a body of water, but the tension between its life-giving flow and the destructive, chaotic power of its flood. He looked at a well-built wall and saw both the safety it provided and the prison it could become. He had internalized the great debate of the gods and now saw it reflected in everything around him. He and Amida parted ways at a dusty crossroads a day's walk from Eridu. Their farewell was not emotional, not filled with promises to meet again. It was a moment of deep, unspoken understanding between two people who had fundamentally changed one another. "Your heart now knows the song of chaos, Stone Shaper," she said, her hand resting for a moment on his arm. It was a gesture of respect, of comradeship. "Do not let the silence of the temple make you forget the music." He watched her walk away, a solitary, resilient figure heading back toward the vibrant, unpredictable, and dangerous world she called home, and felt a pang of loss that was also a sense of gratitude. Azag re-entered Eridu under the cloak of night, slipping through the same gate he had departed from, a ghost returning to his own life. The city, once the entirety of his world, now felt different to him. It seemed smaller, its perfect order now feeling less like a source of strength and more like a point of fragility, a beautiful but brittle piece of pottery that a single, sharp shock could shatter. He made his way to his secluded workshop within the temple precinct. The pristine, untouched block of black diorite waited for him in the center of the room, a silent, monolithic judge. The dust of his long journey, the pale sand of the northern deserts, the rich loam of the riverlands near Uruk, coated his sandals and the hem of his tunic, a foreign, chaotic element in this place of sterile precision. He did not begin carving immediately. For 3 full days and 3 sleepless nights, he simply sat on a low stool before the great stone, his consecrated tools laid out neatly on a cloth beside him. He was not planning his cuts or measuring his lines. He was communing with the stone, with his own purpose. The narrator could delve into his mental process, a quiet, internal montage. He replayed his entire journey in his mind. The profound, silent wisdom of Eridu and its god, Enki. The harsh, soul-crushing perfection of order in Nippur, the city of Enlil. The vibrant, creative, and dangerous chaos of Uruk, the home of Inanna. He understood now, with a clarity that was both exhilarating and terrifying, that law was not a static statement handed down from on high. It was a living conversation, a dynamic, ever-shifting balance between these 3 great forces: wisdom, order, and passion. On the 3rd night, he rose. He went to the loose brick in the wall and retrieved the 2 objects that had started his journey: the heretical diorite fragment and the ancient copper scroll. He unwrapped them and placed them on his workbench, not as secret, shameful things to be hidden, but as guiding principles, his true blueprints. In that moment, he made his final decision. He would not be a mere copyist, blindly recreating the flawed perfection of the past. He would not be a radical revolutionary, shattering the old laws to replace them with chaos. He would be something new. He would be a translator. His task was to articulate the timeless will of the gods in a new language, a language that humanity could use not merely to obey, but to grow. As if summoned by his resolution, a shadow fell across his doorway. Azag's heart froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy hammer on his bench. It was the high priest, Sin, his stooped figure silhouetted against the moonlit courtyard. Azag expected judgment, anger, perhaps even a summary execution for his long absence and his sacrilegious journey. But the old priest's face, when he stepped into the lamplight, was not angry. It was weary, etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed as ancient as the temple itself. "The dust of many cities is on your sandals, son of the Apkallu," Sin said softly. It was not a question. It was a statement. He already knew. Sin entered the workshop, his gaze sweeping over the scene. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, fell upon the copper scroll and the diorite fragment lying openly on the bench. He showed no surprise, no shock. "I have read the reports from the priests of Nippur," he said, his voice a low murmur. "They sent messengers on the fastest boats. They call you a heretic. They say you consorted with rebels and blasphemers. They say you seek to shatter the law." He looked directly at Azag, and his gaze was piercing, seeking the truth in the deepest part of his soul. "But they are wrong, aren't they? You do not wish to shatter it. You wish to temper it. And that," the high priest added with a sigh, "is a far more dangerous ambition." In that quiet, lamplit moment, surrounded by the tools of creation, the high priest revealed his own secret, the burden he had carried for a lifetime. He confessed that he, too, a priest of Enki, had always felt the profound imbalance in the world, the constant, grinding tension between Enki's gift of wisdom and Enlil's unbending demand for command. He had chosen the path of stability, of preserving the existing order at all costs, because he feared the alternative. He had seen what chaos could do. "I chose to be a good shepherd for the flock," he said, his voice tinged with a lifetime of regret. "I kept the walls strong and the granaries full. But I have often wondered if, in keeping my people safe from the wolves, I have also kept them from the greatness that lies beyond the pasture fence." Sin did not give Azag an order or a blessing. He did not tell him what to do. He simply walked over to the blank, waiting stela and placed a hand on its cool, smooth surface. He looked at the stone, then at Azag's scarred, capable hands, and then, finally, into his eyes. He posed the final, terrible question, the one that Azag now had to answer for all of humanity. The law is the voice of the gods, Azag. That is the truth. But the hand that carves the law into the stone is the hand of a man. When you strike this stone, which will guide your chisel? The truth of the heavens as it has always been written, or the truth of humanity as you have so painfully learned it? The high priest turned and left, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Azag in a silence that was now charged with an almost unbearable weight. Sin had not absolved him of his choice. He had placed the entire weight of destiny, of the world's future, squarely upon his shoulders. Azag was alone again, but this time, his solitude was not one of fear or confusion. It was a moment of profound, terrifying clarity. The choice was his, and his alone. He walked to his workbench and picked up his heaviest meteorite hammer and his finest, sharpest bronze chisel. The narrator would describe the scene with an intense, sensory focus. The perfect, comfortable weight of the hammer in his calloused palm. The cool, smooth shaft of the chisel. The muscles in his forearm and shoulder tightening, bunching for the first blow. He stood before the stela, the black, silent, waiting stone. He took a deep, steadying breath, the air in his lungs tasting of stone dust and destiny. He raised the hammer high. The scene could freeze for a moment, the hammer poised at the apex of its arc. Then, with all the force of his conviction, he brought it down. The screen, if there were one, would go black at the precise moment of impact, the sharp, clean, definitive chink of metal striking stone echoing in the darkness. The work, the true work, had finally begun. The final chapter would open not on a single scene, but on a montage of creation, a testament to the sacred act of labor. The narrator's voice would become a low, rhythmic accompaniment, a human chant set against the imagined sounds of the chisel on stone, the sharp tap-tap-tap of the fine work, the heavier thud of shaping the larger forms. Days and nights merged into one continuous flow of effort. Azag became a machine of creation, his entire being, mind, body, and spirit, focused on the monumental task before him. He ate little, standing at his workbench, chewing on a piece of dried barley cake without tasting it. He slept less, catching a few hours on his cot only when his muscles screamed and his vision began to blur. His dreams filled with the shapes of cuneiform. His world shrank to the small, sacred space between his eye and the gleaming bronze tip of his chisel. He was no longer just carving stone. He was weaving a new reality, etching a new destiny for his people, one wedge-shaped mark at a time. He carved the great, foundational laws of cosmology, the stories of the separation of heaven and earth, the setting of the stars in their courses. He carved these with the absolute, unwavering authority he had witnessed in Nippur, the voice of Enlil. He carved the laws of irrigation, of agriculture, the secrets of the canals and the cycles of the moon. He carved these with the deep, flowing, intricate wisdom he had always known in Eridu, the voice of Enki. And he carved the laws of human society, of marriage and family, of festivals and gatherings, with a newfound appreciation for the beautiful, unpredictable, and passionate heart he had discovered in Uruk, the voice of Inanna. He was not choosing one god over another. He was finding the balance, the tense, creative harmony between them in every stroke of his hammer. The work was almost complete. The new stela was a masterpiece, a work that surpassed even the divine perfection of the original. Every line was flawlessly sharp, every sign imbued with a profound and resonant sense of purpose. Azag had poured all of his skill, all of his suffering, all of his journey, and all of his soul into this single block of stone. He had been utterly, painstakingly faithful to the ancient text of the old laws, recreating them with a craftsman's reverence. He approached the final section, the central decree at the very heart of the stela, the law upon which the entire structure of his world was built. This was the moment of his choice, the pivot upon which the future would turn. The law was the foundation of the divine hierarchy, the unshakable chain of command that held the universe together. The original text read, "The Lulu Amalu, the black-headed people, shall bear the yoke of the Anunnaki. In all things, their hands shall obey the will of the heavens." The narrator would describe the immense, crushing weight of that one, single word: obey. It was a chain. It was a wall. It was the foundation of the perfect, soul-crushing cage he had seen in Nippur. Azag hesitated. His hand, so steady and sure for weeks of tireless work, began to tremble. In his mind's eye, he saw the raw, bleeding back of the flogged farmer in Nippur's main square. He heard Amita's passionate voice in the hidden shrine. To deny these gifts is the only true blasphemy. He felt the silent, expectant, and patient wisdom of his god, Enki, a presence that had never left him since his dream. He knew, with uncertainty that went deeper than bone, that he could not carve the word obey. But he could not carve the forbidden prophecy from the hidden fragment either. That would be an open act of rebellion, a cataclysm that would bring the wrath of Enlil down upon them all. He had to find the third path, the narrow trail between the two extremes. His eyes fell upon his bronze tracing stylus lying on the workbench. He remembered his argument with Amita by the fire. Even a river needs banks, he had said. The change, he realized, must not be a shattering of the bank, but a subtle, almost imperceptible redirection of the flow. He picked up his finest, most delicate chisel, a tool used for inscribing the smallest details on royal seals. With the surgical precision of a master, holding his breath, he began to alter the cuneiform signs. He did not change the sentence, only its heart. The symbol for Semet, to obey, was composed of several small wedges. By altering the angle of one wedge and adding a small, almost invisible new one, he transformed it into the word tebu, to seek. It was a simple change of a few small marks, a change that only a master scribe or a god would ever notice. The new law, now carved for eternity in the black diorite, read, "The black-headed people shall bear the yoke of the Anunnaki. In all things, their hands shall seek the will of the heavens." The narrator would let the profound meaning of this change settle into the listener's mind. Obedience is passive and active a tool. Seeking is active. It implies thought. It implies interpretation. It implies struggle and doubt, and, ultimately, it implies wisdom. It was not a declaration of freedom from the gods, but the granting of the freedom to understand them. It was the birth of theology, of philosophy, of science. It was the seed of everything to come. The day of the stela's reconsecration arrived. It was a grand, solemn occasion. The new monument, veiled in white linen, was moved in a great procession from Azag's workshop into the sacred inner chamber of the ziggurat. The entire city of Eridu was assembled in the temple courtyards, their faces filled with awe and relief. Idam Sin, dressed in his most ancient and sacred robes, presided over the ceremony. He anointed the stela with sacred oils and chanted the ancient rites. Finally, he raised his hands for silence and began to read the newly carved laws aloud, his voice echoing in the hallowed space. When he reached the final, central law, he spoke the words clearly and firmly. "Their hands shall seek the will of the heavens." His voice did not falter. He paused for a single, charged heartbeat, and his ancient eyes found Azag's in the crowd of assembled craftsmen. In that silent, fleeting moment, a profound acknowledgement passed between them. The secret was safe. The deed was done. At that exact moment, a single, brilliant beam of the noon sun, channeled through a cleverly designed high window in the temple ceiling, struck the face of the new stela. The narrator would describe this not as a dramatic, supernatural miracle, but as a simple, beautiful, and perfectly timed moment of physics and chance. The light caught the fresh, sharp edges of the newly carved cuneiform word, making the symbol for seek seem to shine for a moment with a light of its own, brighter than all the other words on the stone, before the sun continued on its path and the moment passed. The story would then wind down, its climax reached. Azag was publicly rewarded by the temple with gifts of silver and grain, but he quietly refused a prestigious position among the temple elite. He returned to his humble workshop on the city's edge, content to remain what he had always been, a craftsman, a man of stone and silence. His great and dangerous work was done. From a distance, over the course of the following years, he watched the city, and he began to see the first subtle signs of his secret change taking root, like a slow, patient, and powerful tree. The final scene is set many years later. Azag is a very old man, his hands now gnarled with age, teaching a young, eager apprentice how to hold a chisel. From his workshop doorway, he watches a scene unfolding in the temple school across the way. A group of young children are gathered around a small clay copy of the Great Stela, a lesson tablet. A teacher is explaining the central law to them. A young girl, her face furrowed in intense concentration, raises her hand. "But master," she asks, her voice clear in the afternoon air, "what does it mean to seek?" The teacher, for the first time, does not have a simple, rote answer. He pauses, looks at the question on the tablet, and then at the curious faces of the children. And he begins to discuss it with them. A question had been asked where none was ever permitted before. A conversation had begun. In his workshop, Azag hears the question, and a faint, weary, and deeply satisfied smile touches his lips. The narrator concludes, his voice soft and final. The chisel was laid down. The stone was set in its place. The great work of the gods was finished. And the great work of humanity had just begun. The voice fades into a long, peaceful, and contemplative silence.